Alrighty, y'all. I just bought a new version of PowerPoint that does not allow me to record and convert into video, which was the whole reason why I bought this PowerPoint. So this is what we're going to do. I'm sharing my screen in Zoom. I hope this works for you. Let me know if it does or it doesn't, okay? So let's go ahead and get started with Chapter 6. Alrighty, this week we're talking about interest groups. I'm going to define interest groups for you, what makes an interest group, what the different types of interest groups are, enterprises, associations, things like that, and tell you what role interest groups will have in your role as a professional public administrator out there with your MPA degree. So, pros and cons of interest groups. Interest groups exist to protect the interests, obviously, of certain individuals, groups of individuals that share a common characteristic. So interest groups can be economic, they can be trade associations, for example. The bar associations are trade associations for the legal profession, medical associations, hospital associations, hospitality groups. But these can also protect the public interests, values, and things we care about. Think about people who are on the left side of the political spectrum would support the American Civil Liberties Union. People on the other side would support conservative interest groups like Eagle Forum, Moral Majority, those sorts of things. So it protects the interests of people, the pragmatic interests of people, but it also protects the ideological interests of people and also the public interests. So there are interest groups that have nothing to do with any sort of gain for any individual, but they're more about the ideal. They're interest groups just for child welfare. The people that run child welfare groups have no stake in this. They're caring about the needs of children. How about Greenpeace? Yeah, how about the Sierra Club? These are interest groups, and their interest is protecting the environment. So they cultivate democratic values. Interest groups exist because they together have a collective power that they don't have on their own. Banding together, they represent voters, they represent donors. So they cultivate these democratic values. They aggregate different views. There are so many different views. It's kind of important for politicians that are making these laws to know who stands where, who's powerful, who cares about what. They push policy agendas. They say this is our sole nonpartisan priority, for example. We are just about pushing legislation for tort reform. We just want to end frivolous lawsuits. They encourage political participation because the reason why these groups are so powerful are their mailing lists. Their mailing lists are full of people that care about whatever it is they're advocating for, tax relief, for example, or child welfare, immigrant rights. And they encourage these individuals to contact their representative and push for the right votes. They're also governmental watchdogs. Their political currency is endorsements. So they'll give particular politicians a grade of maybe like an A, B, C, D, or a ranking of how well those people represent that issue. And that lets people know how to vote their values in the next election. Now, what are the cons according to the textbook? They promote their own agendas. Of course they do. They're not going to promote the interests of someone else, but they're so focused on their own agendas that they're definitely not going to be fair and balanced and acknowledge the other side. Of course not. That makes no sense. So this is why it's good to have interest groups that balance each other out. For every abortion rights group, there is a anti-abortion group. Well, not for everyone, but I'm not saying that the stakes are equal. Sometimes there's more money on one side than the other side. In fact, the Hemlock Society has $17 million a year, I believe, and there is no anti-euthanasia equivalent. There's an international equivalent, but there's not one in the United States. So just because an interest exists doesn't mean like there's an equal opposite interest. Of course, for any group about child welfare, you're not going to find a group of interested child abusers that are fighting those laws. So these groups sway public officials. Sometimes they do it not because they're telling public officials the right thing to do, because these are normative questions, not positive questions. If something is normative, it's a value statement. It can't be proven right or wrong. If it's positive, it's a fact statement that can be proven right or wrong. So they sway public officials, and there's no telling, according to your values, if that's a good thing or a bad thing. They have too much clout. That's another thing of, is it a good thing or a bad thing? According to the textbook, they have a lot of power which they exercise. That's more than any individual alone, which is why, of course, people join interest groups. And they have an upper class bias. They support corporate interests. The people that are more likely to join an interest group or support an interest group are those that have something at stake. And this upper class bias is because it costs money to engage in public life and political life, and people are not necessarily going to do it unless there is a political reason to do it that is also economical. People can not necessarily afford to advocate at the legislative level unless they're advocating for protecting their own business interests or maybe getting government funding. So those are the pros and the cons. Defining interest groups. What makes an interest group an interest group is that it's formally organized. It has a name. It has a name. It also should have some sort of legal entity. It should have a tax exemption, or it should have some sort of it should have some sort of name and platform. It shares common goals. It's an interest group because it is centered around an interest, and it attempts to influence electoral and policymaking processes. A bunch of people that get together and share something are not necessarily an interest group until they become formally incorporated. Now, there's not necessarily one way to certify yourself as an interest group. There are a lot of interest groups that don't necessarily have tax exemption, but a way to get the most power possible is to have legal recognition of your group and to pay to be a lobbyist. I think it's $500 in Texas. Types of interest groups. Membership organizations. Join, be a card-carrying member of the ACLU, being a card-carrying member of the National Rifles Association. Then there are associations. Those are groups of individuals that are associating by what brings them together. What do they have in common? And then there are enterprises. Enterprises is another name for a gathering of people that share an economic interest. It's business. You hear enterprises, you think mostly business. And that's what we mean here when we talk about enterprises. Associations don't have business individuals as members as much as they have other groups as members. Enterprises, what makes an enterprise is it's not membership based, and it doesn't have individuals as members. In fact, employees of enterprise are not usually involved or consulted when it comes to this. Basically, it's a shareholder situation. They have farmed out their advocacy to this particular group. Pluralist theory. Pluralist theory just assumes conflict is a part of politics. Conflict is how we get things done. That we have a diversity of interests, and we are going to have conflict, but we need to have consensual outcomes. So we have to have some way of mitigating these interests. If there is even a group that has yet to be formed, there exists a potential interest that may be represented by the attitudes of the individuals. So pluralist theory essentially says that we are going to have all of these different interests. There's going to be conflict. How do we organize ourselves in order to exist, in order to coexist as a society, and also to advance our particular interests? Critiques of pluralism. Is it just something that's innate and apparent for people to come together? Does everyone have an equal voice? Are all potential interests heard? Do interests counterbalance each other? Depends on the power of the interest. Let me give you an example. When it comes to the abortion debate, there are organizations that are extremely well funded, like the Guttmacher Institute, the Texas Policy Project, that come together because they create the research that supports the concept of government funding for birth control and other things provided by Planned Parenthood. And they also fight regulations that interfere with the business of reproductive health. So there's money there because it pays for itself. Is there an equal and opposite interest? Is there a group of researchers that don't look at it from a business interest, but just look at women's health from the anti-abortion standpoint? No, because there's no money in abortion alternatives. There's no money in free diapers. There's no money in pregnancy resource centers. Pregnancy resource centers don't even receive government funding the way Planned Parenthood gets $365 million a year. So do interests counterbalance each other? No. And I also gave another example with euthanasia. You've got George Soros that funds the Hemlock Society, and there is no organization that is funded at all that represents the interests of disability rights groups that are opposed to assisted suicide. So no, not always. Life is not fair. In fact, in many cases, pregnancy resource centers outnumber Planned Parenthood clinics. So are all potential interests heard? Of course not. Do interests counterbalance each other? We like to think they would in this society, but they don't necessarily. How do interest groups form? Interest groups form when there is some disturbance in the force. Here's what I mean. There were no groups that were fighting for traditional marriage, fighting against gay marriage, until there were groups that started fighting for gay marriage. It was just kind of assumed that marriage was what it had always traditionally had been until groups came and started fighting for gay marriage. And then you had groups like National Organization of Marriage, NOMA, I think it's called. Before Roe v. Wade, we didn't have a National Right to Life organization, but National Right to Life Association. I can't remember, but it's National Right to Life is what they're known as. So disturbance theory says things are going along just fine, and there's some sort of shock. Punctuated equilibrium is another theory. Punctuated equilibrium says that you have equilibrium. Equilibrium is like homeostasis. And then something comes along and punctures it, punctuated, like bam, like think of a period, stop, think of an exclamation point, boom, that changes that. And as a response to that, interest groups create themselves around that issue. Peer pressure, coercion, selective benefit is also where these groups come from. Let me explain. Peer pressure. I have 2 degrees in social work, a bachelor's and a master's, but I have not had a need to get licensed because I focus more on teaching, obviously. And continuing ed is a real pain, especially when I'm, studying things on my own as an academic. So I have not gotten a license. However, if I wanted to join the faculty at many universities that have a social work department, they insist on me being a member of the National Association of Social Workers, the NASW. So there's peer pressure, so we're not free riding. So go down to that last one, the free rider problem. There's peer pressure from the peers that, okay, don't be, what is it, a scab, I think it's called, if you're not a member of the union. So peer pressure, you really need to be a member of this. You say you are a feminist, you need to be a member of the Feminist Majority Leadership Alliance. You say you're an environmentalist. Well, why are you not a member of the Sierra Club? There's also coercion. Coercion is exactly what I explained. Okay, the only way you can keep your job is, or get a job is if you are a member of this interest group. There's also something called selective benefits. Selective benefits are those benefits that are reserved to stop the free rider problem. If you don't join the NRA, but you are a gun owner and you appreciate your ability to own guns, so you are pro-Second Amendment. So you are a gun owner. However, you don't give to the NRA. You're still benefiting from the NRA because the NRA is still advocating for you. So someone has to pay the NRA to do that. So how do they get people to join? Because that money has to come from somewhere. Well, if you join the NRA, you get the expressive benefit of saying, hey, I'm a card-carrying member of the NRA. You get a nice little sticker to put on your door that hopefully deters thieves. That's exactly what my daddy did. And you get your choice of several magazines. You get automatic insurance for your firearms. So there are selective benefits that come with paying in. The free rider problem is a big problem. Free ride, and I am not a member of the NASW because they advocate for some things that are not according to my values. However, I still, as somebody with a social work background, get the benefits. So I've always felt a little guilty about being a free rider, but there was nothing I could do about that in good conscience. But if I wanted to get a job as a social worker, I did not have access to that jobs board if I wasn't a member. So that's what selective benefits are. Selective benefits are a very smart way of enticing people to join your group, because if without members, you don't have dues, and without dues, you don't have any money with which to get things done. And membership is also a big part of your power. You can say you have a mailing list of this many people. That makes politicians perk up. In fact, the AARP is probably the most powerful lobby group because it represents the most people, represents Americans over age 65, and it has the biggest mailing list. So it reaches the largest number of potential voters. So how are interest groups maintained? Like I said, they have material benefits, they have dues, they have donors and funding, they have solidarity benefits. A solidarity benefit is I get to say that I'm a member of this particular group of which I care, about which I care. Then you have the rise of policy entrepreneurs. Policy entrepreneur comes from, I use this in my dissertation. I use Mentrum. There's also Kingdon and policy streams. Policy entrepreneurs are those individuals that create solutions to policy problems and actually navigate that through the political process. So who joins interest groups? Find out that if you have a higher income, you're more likely to join. If you have more education, you're more likely to join. And if you hold a more professional job. So we have, once again, that participation bias that we talked about in earlier chapters. Participation bias is the people that most likely need advocacy, people of lower incomes, people of less education, people of more menial jobs are at least likely to join an interest group to advocate for themselves, which is kind of where the whole thought of labor unions comes from. So there's lobbying. What do lobbyists do? There's a big difference between lobbying, y'all, and electioneering, and I'm going to talk about that difference. Lobbying is when you are trying to change the outcome of votes of politicians that have been already elected. Electioneering is when you try to change the votes of people to elect the people that are going to do what you want when they're in office. So what do lobbyists do? They have insider and outsider activities. Insider activities include testifying at legislative hearings, contacting government officials directly, alerting state legislators to the effect of bills in their districts. Outsider, entering into coalitions with other groups, having influential constituents contact the legislator's office. So there are insider and outsider lobbyists. There's in-house lobbyists. Those are people that, they lobby in-house. They are paid lobbyists for an organization. Then there are contract lobbyists that are outsiders that are paid as a contractor. There are government lobbyists that work on behalf of their particular government entity, and there are people like me. I consider myself a voluntary lobbyist. I go and I testify on bills. I provide research. I provide consulting services, but I do not charge. I do not charge because I do this to advocate my values, not because I do this for a living. Now, let's talk about the rise of State House lobbying corps. There is something called the revolving door. And the revolving door is a tendency of former chiefs of staff, former representatives, former elected officials leaving their positions in state politics and becoming lobbyists, and representing very deep-pocketed interests. The reason why they're worth that much money and they're paid that much money is because they know people. They know they have that inside track. They already have name recognition. They already have allies and everything else that they need. There are differences in regulation, and in your textbook you'll see the differences in regulation in lobbyists. There's all these different rules. Because the West Texas, the Czech stop, the Little Czech Bakery in West, right south of Hillsboro, about an hour north of Waco. I wanted to take some kolaches down to my bill sponsor when I was working last session. And apparently that's considered a bribe if I didn't stay in the office and eat that kolache with him. If you're eating that kolache with him, then you are just a constituent or just a lobbyist, that's fine, that is educating them, and you're doing it over food. However, if you leave it as a gift, then that is a violation of the rules. There are also limits to the price of the gift you can leave. So there are different regulations based on which state you live in. But lobbyists tend to outnumber lawmakers. There are more interests than there are representatives and senators. Issue advocacy. Issue advocacy is where you focus on the issue, and your coalition is based around an issue. Let me talk a little bit about AstroTurf mobilization. AstroTurf mobilization, another word for this, is AstroTurf lobbying. You know, grassroots lobbying. Grassroots is you're starting boots on the ground. You're starting from the ground up, and you're working your way up. Well, AstroTurf is not real grass. It was named after the Astrodome. It was meant to have properties that real grass doesn't have. It's fake. So is AstroTurf mobilization. What AstroTurf mobilization is, y'all, is when very deep-pocketed people who care about an issue. An issue advocacy, the definition of the textbook, is a form of political speech that mentions issues and positions taken on those issues by elected officials or candidates, but stops short of expressly advocating support or defeat of those issues. One reason for this is because depending on your tax exemption, you are only allowed a certain percentage of advocacy you can do, but you're allowed to be educational on certain issues. So you can keep your 501c3, which allows you to take tax-deductible donations and not turn yourself into a 501c4 that is a political action committee that cannot, and that would take a real hit to your revenue and your operating revenue. But you have to keep that, and I believe it is 20%. I need to double check. If anyone wants me to double check that for you, I can. But this is an indirect tactic. They don't say vote this way or that way, but they say here's the problems if you voted this way, here's the benefits if you voted another way, but I'll leave it up to you. This is the tactic that I have always taken. I've always issued my position as an individual, and you certainly have the right to do that. But when I work representing an organization, and I say work, I do this as a volunteer, but when I'm representing an organization, I'm working in an educational capacity. So AstroTurf mobilization is when you don't have any real interest in your subject matter, but you invent that. A good example of AstroTurf mobilization is what the Hemlock Society, they go as Compassion and Choices in Dying now. They pay people to go around and get these petitions, and then they present these petitions at the hearing showing, the last time I was in Connecticut, here are 4,000 people that want assisted suicide to be made legal. Now, these are not people that cared enough to reach out and sign a petition. These were people that, because they have so much money, the Hemlock Society was able to go and get that money, go and find people that share that conviction and get them to sign up. You can do a lot if you have money. and they make it look like people really care about an issue that they don't necessarily care about. And there's that issue of earned media. Earned media is when you create events that get you press and make it look like there's more interest in your issue than there truly is. And ballot measures. Ballot measures are a common way of touching issues that are wedge issues, that are issues that, and we talked about this before, issues that are not necessarily on any party platform, that are very controversial. Good example of this is marijuana legalization. That's not on a party platform of the Democrats, and Republicans don't necessarily want to touch it. But a majority of people are for it now. If you look at public opinion has shifted. Electioneering. Guys, electioneering differs from lobbying in that electioneering works on campaigns or financing candidates in order to get the people elected that are going to advance the cause of a particular interest. Political action committees do electioneering as well as lobbying. So basically, it's lobbying is retroactive electioneering. So interest group contributions to state candidates are typically nonpartisan, unless it is a party-based, like Republican women's group that focus on women's issues, but they are Republican. Of course, they're going to give to Republicans that share whatever particular values they have. Log cabin Republicans, a good example. That's partisan, but it's a partisan group of Republicans that supported LGBT rights. Litigation, another interest group technique, and this is very, very common, and I'm going to go ahead and use Compassion and Choices in Dying, the Hemlock Society again. They often try to get laws they don't like against assisted suicide overturned by the courts. They were successful doing this in New Mexico. New Mexico came back and eventually overturned their overturn. They did this in Montana. Assisted suicide is neither legal nor illegal in Montana because of their challenge. In fact, it was these cases that challenged the law that actually changed the law. It struck down the law. Brown versus the Board of Education. Separate but equal is not equal. And it ended, well, it didn't actually end segregation, but it was crucial to ending segregation. It was the first major step in desegregating schools. And of course, Roe v. Wade struck down instantly the abortion laws in all 50 states. Some states had already legalized abortion at that point. And then there's also the amicus brief. Amicus means friend of the court brief. I have done a bunch of these, been a part of a bunch of these. I've actually written an amicus brief that went to the Supreme Court on a particular issue for a particular plaintiff. So these are also powerful interest group techniques. So the advocacy explosion expanded in the 60s and 70s. Think civil rights, guys. Think Southern Christian Leadership Coalition, the SCLC. Think of the moral majorities, the rise in professional associations, decline in traditional civic associations. So we used to have the Lions Club and Kiwanis, and you had all of these groups that did these civic organizations. These civic organizations kind of took a shift and turned into professional associations, membership associations, and lobbying associations. And if you're interested in that development, I don't think it's necessarily important for you to know as a public administrator historically. It is in your textbook if you want to read about that, how they sort of emerged. What I think is important is to know who the big players are. So let's go on to the big players. So density and diversity. Density is the amount of interest groups per capita. So how many interest groups do we have per number of citizens? And diversity. How broad are the interests that are represented? So the largest economies generate the most groups because it takes money to have these groups, y'all. You have to have some sort of interest in order to fund it. So even if it's funded by donors and not necessarily by economic interest, you have to have enough people. So interest group system density is a way of saying, okay, you know, we have got so many interest groups and the ratio of interest groups to people. Diversity, like I said, is the depth and breadth of ideologies represented. So, explaining this density and diversity. If there's more competition, more political competition, you are going to have more interest groups fighting to get their way. Initiative use. If there are more ballot initiatives, you're going to have more groups with registered lobbyists trying to sway those initiatives this way. So like ballot measures. So the more diverse the interest group systems are, the more distributed progressive policies. The more party competition, and we discussed this last week, the more you're going to have politicians that want to claim credit, position take, credit claim, and rent seek. So you're going to have politicians that are going to play it safe if they have the incumbency advantage, and they're not going to risk that by sticking their neck out on a progressive policy. However, if there's a 5% margin of them potentially being unseated in the next election, they're going to fight harder to protect their seat. So, interest groups, who's got clout? Private economic interests have a lot of clout because they have a lot of money and they represent a lot of money, and people have a lot to lose. You have a lot of internal resources and external factors. If you have a lot of members that you can affect the outcome of an election. So let's talk about the most influential business interests. General business organizations, school teachers organizations, the NEA, the TEA, utility companies, manufacturers, hospital nursing home associations. I would include on this lawyer organizations, legal organizations. The Texas Bar Association is incredibly powerful in Texas. The Texas Medical Association is incredibly powerful. The Texas Hospital Association is incredibly powerful. They just represent a lot of money that they donate to campaigns. And they represent a lot of powerful people that have money, a lot of doctors and lawyers. So, relative impact of interest groups. There is in your textbook a list of states that say, okay, how powerful are interest groups? And why are they powerful? Are they dominant? So basically, are interest groups the ones that are innovating and getting things done in states? Are they innovating, getting things done, but also a necessary or sufficient condition to getting things done? Are they just complementary? So do they just help get things done, but they can't really necessarily do anything on their own? Or are they complementary but really subordinate? Are they really ineffective? They really don't matter. In Texas, and it depends on where you are. If you were in a state with a professional legislature, that means the legislators are paid full-time. The legislators have full-time staff, and this is considered their job, a professional association, a professional legislature. They are going to need interest groups far less. But especially, and if you have an annual legislature, you're going to need interest groups far less. If you have a part-time legislature and you meet biannually, you are going to need those interest groups. You're going to rely on them to fill that void. So it depends a lot what your state has in terms of a legislature. Do they have a hybrid, or do they have a professional legislature, or do they have a citizen legislature where people are paid a little bit and they only work part-time and they're expected to have jobs outside of the legislature? All righty, well, that's it for this week. I'm going to put your quiz up online for you. And per normal, you are my grad students and I love you. You're my favorite. Don't tell all my other students, but I love you the most. If you need me, you guys have my phone number, all right? You can always reach me by email, but you've got my number. All right, I hope you have a great week. If I can help with anything, you let me know, okay? All righty. I will see you guys Thursday night for our seminar.